Yep. You can use this to write.
I'm not going to, but I would like to open up my slides. Can I minimize things without breaking them?
So if you want to minimize, you just click this arrow and
Okay.
it minimizes it. And you can search for your slides. I think this no name should be.
No, it's Kai.
Put it in Visual Studio online and I save it. But when you're just working with yourself, there's less incentive to go check it in and check it out.
Yeah, scoot your face. There we go. Okay, fine. Okay, that's nice by me. Okay. So, is it doing screen share?
Yeah, it's doing everything.
So I am senior manager of marketing R&D technology and marketing. We have a new big data initiative.
Get over there. Ah, go away.
You're doing the big data certificate then?
Yeah.
The 5 classes?
I'm negotiating at least one of them, which was the database.
No. That was a hard class, but it was actually hard. This I really liked it.
Was or was not?
It was hard. Yeah.
So what was it?
All right. Sorry about the delay. Gotta love technology. So, I'm Tamara Denning, giving a guest lecture here, clearly. I am new faculty in the School of Computing. My area is computer security and privacy, but I like to take a very human-centric focus on, within security and privacy. So, I glanced around at some faces, but some of you are pretty far away. Are any of you in my security class? Good, you won't be bored, because most of this is something that you would have seen before that got snuck in there. So to give me a little bit of context, how many of you are currently working full-time? And how many of you have sort of worked full-time in the past? And how much of that was specifically related to big data? Okay, so...
a hand gesture for that much.
That much, okay. So some of you may have some interesting examples to jump in and weigh in with. In general, this talk is fairly high level, which some of you may enjoy and may drive some of you crazy. There will also be a couple times where I will ask you to chat with your neighbors, which means that a couple of you cannot do so unless you shout. So you might want to move if you aren't close enough. Or I'll just stare at you, or I'll just make fun of you, either way. It's a free world. So, right, I'm going to go ahead and get started then. The general topic that I'm here chatting about is ethics and privacy, generally speaking, in the realm of big data. So this is not a definitive guide. It's not sort of comprehensive, and take it with a grain of salt, but I think it's important to at least start to think about these kinds of issues. So I would imagine that if you don't know from personal experience or enthusiastic and sometimes bizarre news coverage, or you may have even talked about it in this class, what are some of the wonderful, positive benefits we're going to get out of big data? We're very excited. Why are we excited? Yes?
Target advertising to the right people.
Targeted advertising. We like to make money. Okay. Why else are we excited? I think I saw you first.
Personalized health.
Personalized health. Okay. Hand over there. Oh, no? Were you stretching?
Yeah. We can figure out what features are working and flow our software.
Okay. Sure. And sort of extrapolating from streamlining in general, any other sort of non-software cases? How about like logistics or food distribution? No? Okay, all right. So we're very excited about big data, right? All you have to do is read the White House tech report that they released last year. They're very excited, right? Another thing that comes up as well, that was one of the specific case scenarios in there, was this idea of, so we're talking about personalized health, wouldn't that be grand? Based on DNA, based on just seeing what interventions are working and aren't, those sorts of things. Also things like education. I haven't seen any specifics about how we're going to do this, but apparently big data and education is very exciting. Okay, so we're excited about big data. And, clearly there are exciting positive uses. And this will start to come up later in the talk. We'll start hitting this point over and over again, but one of the sort of exciting features one might say, is we don't know what we're going to find. It's exciting. We just sort of dig until something exciting comes up. Which, of course, depending on exactly what I mean by that, can drive some statisticians crazy because, you can dig and find things that don't really mean anything. But anyway, privacy. How would you define privacy, or what is privacy to you? Yes.
Keeping what's mine to myself, not having people know what I have.
Okay. So control and also this element of sort of confidentiality or secrecy. Other opinions about privacy? Yes?
Being able to choose very carefully which pieces of my information are shared and which are not.
Okay. So there's sort of an amount of granularity, that amount of sort of ownership again coming in there, and choice. So you kind of hit on the control, you were hitting on choice. Okay. So it's a little bit of a trick question because it's privacy itself is really a terribly overloaded term, which is something to keep in mind when there are sort of either one-on-one or loud communal debates about privacy, is not everyone means the same thing, which can really muddy the debate. But it's an overloaded kind of word, and let's look at some different kinds of ways to think about privacy and also to sort of, let's conceptualize. So I'm going to start in the legal sphere. So of course the disclaimer that was the beginning of the talk holds as well now. I'm not a lawyer, so hey, but. So originally, there, at least, and this is very sort of Eurocentric, there wasn't per se this legal concept of privacy separate from just ownership of property. But here's a nice little quote that comes from England's, I believe, laws, a couple hundred years back. So we have a listing about sort of private property and invasion, property and invasion of property. But then there's this little clause that sort of, where private papers are removed and carried away, sort of the secret nature of those goods is an aggravation of the trespass and demand more considerable damages in that respect. So we do have a notion of privacy, but it is all wrapped up in sort of ownership of physical items. Okay. So you may hear people talking about Warren and Brandeis, that sort of last century first started to, in the US, formalize what we mean when we're talking about privacy and kind of migrated its way into tort law, among other things. So they had this article that was called The Right to Privacy. And I wanted to be excited to read it, but honestly it talks about a lot of legal precedents, so if you don't necessarily understand the context of the precedents, it gets a little unentertaining. But basically, the idea was this was particularly aggravated and in reaction to things like photography becoming actual technology that was used, and things like those photos being printed in newspapers and distributed. So then they started to actually say, let's talk about privacy as a thing to which we have a right. Okay? Chats? Do I get some chats too? So they started to articulate these particular items that sort of constituted the sphere of privacy, one of which was not even the things that we've been talking about here, but more about solitude, that you should have the right to be alone and not be bugged. So this kind of thing does come up in software, but it tends to be not necessarily framed in terms of privacy as much. But perhaps you might talk about this in the context of pop-up ads. You were trying to be alone with your article, maybe, and it gets in the way, right? Yeah, it's a stretch, but this was one aspect of privacy. Also, there was this, a little closer to what we've been talking about, something that has to do with reputation, and something that has to do with sort of your ownership of facts about yourself. So maybe privacy has to do with being able to control public discourse of embarrassing private facts about yourself. So also started to get into ideas like slander, right? This isn't sort of about true information being leaked, it's false information being shared, right? Which, in a sense, you see reflected in some of the conclusions that are being sort of drawn with big data and data mining about a consumer and individuals. I mean, you could draw some parallels. And then this sort of we would almost more categorize in terms of intellectual property, right? Or sort of copyrighted material. So this idea of owning yourself. Okay, so that was fun. A theme that is here and that really you can sort of in general use to investigate the history of privacy is this idea that, more chats, really? That privacy is reactionary. Oh, it's useful chats, my mistake. This is telling us that we're having a technical problem. Sorry. I'll keep talking. All right. Privacy is reactionary. So this didn't really, this issue of ownership of your picture and information gossip being spread about you didn't really become a problem until the technology supported it and people realized they didn't like it. So technology and privacy have this intimate kind of relationship, and it tends to be reactionary. So we can, and it helps if we think ahead of time about sort of what side effects might be, but we can't always anticipate them or, normal.
That should work. Okay, where are the slides?
Is it the lower right-hand corner? You got something dragged off or minimized? No, that was just
No.
that's Hangouts.
Which folder did you open the slides?
So it would be Keynote because Keynote opened my PowerPoint apparently. That's okay.
Yep, but it's not.
Let's open it again. It is the guy in the lower right-hand corner.
This one?
Thanks, yeah. Because I was going to advance to the next slide. So I'll just pretend this is a visual description. You may hear the phrase, "I know it when I see it," which sort of has its roots in a particular case. This is the Supreme Court justice saying this, and it was in this case a pornography case. But it was this sort of, can you give a clear definition for pornography, sort of a priori? And there was this statement, the whole statement isn't quite as entertaining as the sub-snippet, which is basically, I'm not going to define pornography, but I know it when I see it, right? So same kind of thing with privacy that mostly won't cover us. That it's reactionary and sort of, we define what privacy is by when we feel it's been violated, broadly speaking. So some people refer to privacy as this sort of contested issue. We all argue about what privacy means, but sort of that's part of the values that we keep arguing about it. So talking a little bit about legal, I'm going to bring in a little bit of social science flavored theory. And that is because I think, again, these different kinds of definitions of privacy can be useful in terms of actually sort of designing and creating technologies. For example, here is one definition of privacy that is incredibly strongly intertwined with norms and context. So the idea here is, for just generally speaking, that you can't, without sort of going and asking everyone what they expect, be able to say whether or not something violates privacy. That was a little vague. But the fact that with certain groups of people, you know, something would be a privacy violation in a certain kind of usage context, and for others it isn't. And sort of that is intrinsically wrapped up in the definition itself. So another theory of privacy, and one that gets used a lot, sort of borrowed a lot by people that are in computer science and sort of border on the edge with comp technologies, has to do with this privacy regulation theory. And the key points here are sort of dynamic and control, essentially. So saying that privacy regulation is all about controlling access to yourself and to your information, but it's not static. There's this sort of situationally, depending on context, again, and depending on sort of the feedback that you get, you're going to go ahead and adjust that boundary. This particular idea of privacy is sort of hitting on this this private-public dichotomy, and there's this whole metaphor running that sort of life is like performing on a stage. So for a certain audience, based on, you know, that context, again, you might share certain information, but if you take something out of time or out of place or out of audience, then you have problems and there is a violation of privacy. And then you have other things like, that's really ugly. Well, we'll just pretend. And then you have things like, well, can we start to design interfaces and technologies that sort of have privacy features by clumping people roughly by what they need, by what serves them. So there's been various attempts at doing this. They all have their own special little flaws, but this particular one was kind of mid-late century and focused a lot on sort of big corporation data gathering practices, which of course are very different now. And the idea here was that theoretically people are in three categories. You have the fundamentalists, the pragmatists, and the unconcerned, which are pretty self-descriptive. The pragmatists just feel really passionately about privacy. It doesn't matter if there's an actual effect that can be measured. Sort of they feel about privacy like, you know, life and liberty and happiness. It's like life, liberty, happiness, and privacy, right? And they will care about it greatly and invest extra sort of effort in caring and money and caring about their privacy. Pragmatists are where, by most metrics, most of the population falls. They like their privacy and they care about certain aspects of it more than others, but give it up for convenience, for discounts, to get whatever it is done, because it doesn't matter too much in this context. And unconcerned is kind of what it sounds like. They want to share everything with the world. So, out of curiosity, how many of you feel like a pragmatist? We got some cypherpunk flavored people in here. Okay. How many people feel like a pragmatist? Wait, did I just say pragmatist or pragmatist?
Pragmatist.
Okay, all right, pragmatist. Sorry, my bad. How many of you feel like a fundamentalist? Okay, fewer of those. How many of you feel unconcerned? How many of you have really tired arms? Okay. So, why am I telling you this when your job is to make technology? Well, because you can use these kinds of things as inspirations for different ways that you approach the technology affordances that you build in. So consider, and you don't have to, you know, go specifically with one of them, the kind of ideas that come up here. Consider what kinds of, you know, how would you say that Twitter more or less does this? So now there are like some private messages, but sort of the original fundamental kind of Twitter model. Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to say that it has some analogs to the presentation of self in everyday life, and you're either on the stage in public feed, or you are off stage in private feed. For example, Facebook. So these models are starting to change a little bit, but Facebook, for example, the traditional model, how would you describe that? In vague relation to the things I talked about. I heard something. Oh, sure, okay. So you think that Facebook has something to do with privacy segmentation, and that sort of maybe a certain kind of person uses Facebook? And maybe you don't worry about the others, you just build with that model. So Google Plus, on the other hand, starts to, at least in its original instantiation, had the circles model, right? It wasn't just friends and non-friends. It had various kinds of circles that could be coworkers, drinking buddies, hiking people, those sorts of things. And you start to get, say, for example, maybe that's conceptual privacy. Maybe that supports that kind of approach. Any kind of suggestions, and I will give you a few minutes to brainstorm on other ways you could approach making a privacy model, given those kinds of ideas. And if you're sitting next to someone, feel free to talk with them, but I guess I won't force you. But I'm going to stare at you. What? Yes. The second one is actually on sort of access to self-secure information, and that changes.
Yeah. I mean, the conceptual model is
Well, I hope that should work. They're having some microphone here is not detecting anything.
Is it directional?
No, it's built in microphone from the laptop, but it's still not getting anything. So I have to use my laptop.
Okay, do you want me to pace it closer? Can they hear me all right? Okay.
Otherwise, I can bring it up and put it up.
Well, there is a power up.
There's also private, so like it's not that
Oh, okay. I'm going to pull things back in. So, what are some suggestions for entirely or somewhat different privacy models for things in general, but specifically, social networks, for example? Perhaps inspired by these, perhaps not. Yes.
So Snapchat is another social network that like all the conversations are private and they also disappear. Just privacy and then you have a record of that.
Okay. So by the way, from the point of view, we're relying on that.
Yeah.
But that's model. So you might say it's performance and then it ends, for example. Or you just felt like it and that's not like those things. That's possible too. Other kinds of models? Yes.
Maybe if you were to define privacy as your ability to control information about yourself in general. So like Twitter, you have very small something there, just spreads out everything. On Facebook, you have two levels of granularity, like public information and information that friends can see. And Google plus you have various circles. You have a lot more fine range about who gets information that you choose to use Google plus.
So suggestions for new kinds of or different kinds of approaches to if you're building your own social network? Maybe not.
Probably mimic Google Plus's model where you can organize people into different groups.
Okay.
And you choose what information goes to what group. Since most people are going to have a lot more objects than groups.
Okay. Yes.
I can imagine including a self-destruct in messages or anything shared. But then you say you're getting here and you control the other person's machine.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned that all the things with the screenshot. Your whole thing was broken.
And if you sort of employ this kind of theorem model, you could, for example, maybe not necessarily have something like times up, but have some kind of thing that you could, control removal of later. Again, that says nothing about constant archive. Yes.
So start everyone out as a track like this, and then as they continue to discuss and interact with the system, more and more it works with as they settings. Like say, I'm sharing a share report, I want to share the share report. But at the beginning, you don't share.
Okay. So pick a default and then start to try to learn from their preferences to assume they have, and then yeah. And there are all kinds of interesting research approaches, by the way, in terms of sort of collaborative privacy settings and all these other kinds of things. But so here are some other kinds of privacy models, for example. Say there's something like a chat room, but it's sort of the opposite of an IRC. In that in IRC, you don't necessarily, you have a pseudonym, and sort of every line that someone says can be attributed to that pseudonym. But you don't necessarily know who matches with that pseudonym elsewhere. So you can have a different kind of model where you know sort of everyone, the identity of everyone who's chatting, but you don't know who said what. It's a different kind of way. Something that I I know at least there's one example of a social network that did that this years ago, but it was somewhere in Asia. But you now actually see, I learned after I made this slide, that Facebook is starting to put in features that have this quality of life tell you, which is the sort of feedback, being able to see what your audience is when you post something. To clarify, they have for a little while been putting in these nudges that say, hey, this many people can see what you're posting. But they have these new kinds of features where you can see which people or how many people saw a post. So this, for example, supports both who's in the audience and dynamic regulation. Because either sort of no one's looking at it and maybe that means I stopped posting, or maybe that means I didn't feel like it's posted, or you suddenly realize you're looking at things aren't factual. Okay, so the point of this was there are lots of different ways to think about privacy. If you brainstorm some of them, you will come up with entirely different models from some of the systems in terms of status quo. Wasn't that fun? So, another issue, and that was privacy in general, less specificity to big data. We're going to get a little more big data flavor. Question of terminology is, again, because privacy is overloaded and this conversation gets a bit muddled. Maybe privacy isn't the right term, because many of the things that upset people about big data and so-called privacy come from public feeds. Sometimes, as we're going to get into later, from sort of crossing public things together and sort of building a more complete profile. So is that privacy? Well, it's about controlling your information. But if you're talking about the public-private kind of dichotomy, it was public, so why is this worrisome? So more legal scholar references. There's this, particular term that one lawyer used. He said maybe what we should be calling it is data abuse, sort of the abuse of data about yourself. Your data doing something you don't like. Again, reactionary, right? And you hear people talking about the mosaic of information. We're going to be hitting this a bit more. The idea that you have these multiple data sources, what do they build together? They make you feel uncomfortable, or they don't, for example. So, what are some potential interesting sources of data for big data kinds of applications, either from the sort of individual's privacy point of view, or from the I want to build an amazing application and do lots of data mining point of view? What kind of interesting data sources do we have? Yes.
Medical records?
What kind of records?
Medical records?
Medical records. All right. That would clearly be helpful for personalized health and for interventions and things. Yes. Retail. So again, we were talking about advertising earlier. What kinds of records?
Fast track, bridge passes and toll.
Sure, we're talking about sort of optimizing road construction and how to do dynamic tolling and those kinds of things.
Well, and also tracking. Like knowing where certain vehicles.
Oh, and a creepy point of view. Yes. It can be tracking. Yes. Creepy or non-creepy? Yes.
Slightly less creepy with the traffic thing. You want to know where people are, where's your traffic going, rather than just where are those points. If that makes sense. Like what kind of paths are people going to take you across the city?
Okay. Which can tell you something, for example, about road maintenance. Yeah, those roads probably need servicing more. When are they used? Let's use it, Other sources of data, yes. Shipping, either sort of on the ground or on the land shipping, yes, in terms of logistics, sure, and then also, okay. You can also do sort of environmental benefits from that, creating less resources.
Telecommunications and cellular data.
Okay. From both non-creepy and creepy points of view? Yes.
Census?
What in particular do you have in mind? Oh, the census. The census.
That's the U.S. census.
Yes, the U.S. Census. Yes. Is that yes?
Oh, could you map internet, like internet connections and where computers are?
Yeah, definitely from a creepy point of view, also potentially from a useful point of view. Among other things, you can sort of do all kinds of, DDoS detection and things. So, the point is, lots of interesting sources of data from a creepy and a non-creepy point of view. Social media, purchases, medical records, legal records, geolocation data, photo streams. We've got all of our, Fitbits and everything now as well, and that's interesting in terms of how that plays into insurance fraud cases and all these other things. But I'm trying to remember if people either keep supposing or there's actually been a case where one of these kinds of things was someone requested in a divorce case. But we've got this whole fun realm, coming. So there are, of course, lots of ways you can characterize these sources, but some of the ways you might characterize them, roughly speaking, is the data feed public or private? And there are lots of realms in between that. Maybe you can pay for it, pay to acquire it, right? Okay. Maybe, is it primary or secondary? By which I mean, did the person generate it, or did you sense it about the person? Is it content, or is it metadata? We, of course, have hilarious debates on that front. And is it sort of first use, or is it second use? So if I clicked on a privacy policy and thought that, whether or not, regardless of what it actually says, and I thought I was providing it, to a first party for one kind of use, if it gets used in a way I didn't expect, that tends to make me more upset, roughly speaking. So if you want to be concerned about privacy, some different people you might be, or your parties, entities you might be worried about might be the government. Right, maybe you're worried about surveillance. You might be worried about companies because maybe either you don't like targeted advertising, or maybe there's sort of dynamic pricing based on what they think you can pay or not, and that makes you angry, dynamic sales. Or maybe just you services denied to you because of some metric. Individuals. So maybe there's some aspect of deprecation to others, or being stopped, these kinds of things. Anything else come to mind? Yes. Spammers? Okay. I guess, especially if the spammer is not an individual, they're probably not a company, and they're probably not a government, so yes. All right, what kinds of harms can come from violations of privacy? Either, personally speaking, what makes you upset, or what other kinds of harms exist? Yes?
Loss of property.
Loss of property. So maybe someone uses it to find out that you're not home, and they steal your stuff because they know you have expensive things.
Which happened. I mean, not with me, but...
Yeah. If you didn't see it, I think it might still be up, but there's a, pleaserobme.com, which essentially just sort of has a script that looks for public tweets that say when people are on vacation. Sort of a public service announcement Twitter feed. Other potential harms.
You could lose a job or jeopardize your career if some unsavory information out to you.
Definitely.
Or if you became a meme or something like that.
So there's both kind of hiring discrimination and sort of consequences when you have that job. Other kinds of harms. Yes.
We've seen historically would be in an outgroup like a religion can do to you. Or worse.
Okay.
So having that information public when you were trying to use it private.
And also sort of aspects about how information is used at a certain time doesn't mean that it will always be used well. I always love it when you have sort of someone in charge of a database and there aren't sort of technical measures to protect privacy. They're like, well, I wouldn't do anything bad with the data. You're like, A, I trust you. B, you cannot change your mind. C, that's assuming that no one else can get hold of the data and legally or illegally. That's not very helpful, but thanks. Other kinds of harms. Well, I kind of like this characterization, which comes from a sort of Canadian privacy agency. So, interesting factoid, Canada actually has a privacy commissioner. You know, the US doesn't have a privacy commissioner, but Canada has a privacy commissioner. And this came out of a particular report that was talking about privacy and in general, when you're building big data applications, weighing sort of the benefits against the risks, right? And this particular figure divides privacy harms up into sort of the tangible, so theft, you know, assault, etc. The intangible, so here we've got, because it's just creepy, and you can find out things about me I didn't know. So did any of you see in the news, a handful of years back, it was Target or Walmart or someone, that was, Target, yeah, that was collecting various shopping habit information. And for example, they're able to tell that you might be pregnant if you start buying like unscented lotions and saltine crackers and not even necessarily just actual baby products. So there was this particular case that made the news where they started sending like baby product flyers to a woman, I'm not sure what her age was, who was still living with her parents. I think she was fairly young, and for example, the father didn't know that she was pregnant. So this was sort of a whole, you know, creepy inference, right? And then you go all the way over to the abstract, which is things that people start bringing up in the context particularly of government surveillance as kind of a counter-argument to, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why does it matter? There are various kinds of studies that have to do with some of the chilling effects of knowing that things aren't private. You might start self-censoring. There's this whole concept of the panopticon. That's how many people that's ringing a bell? Panopticon? A couple? Okay. So the original idea had to do with this theoretical installation in prison, where you have sort of prison cells, more or less in a circle, around this tower in the center. And it essentially had sort of glass where they could see out, but you couldn't see in. So the prisoners never knew if they were being watched or not. The idea being it helps enforce good behavior because, you know, Big Brother is watching you. Could be watching. So that's really more on the abstract end. And another thing they include in there, which I like talking about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, has to sort of, you may not categorize as privacy, depending on how you, again, define privacy, but things like social stratification and filter bubbles. So how many of you have heard of a filter bubble / echo chamber? About a couple. Okay. The general concept is a young internet was fantastic because suddenly, you know, if you had a small local community, you could connect with people around the world who sort of share similar interests and very empowering, right? On sort of the reverse flip of that is now that both in terms of personal choices you might make in your browsing habits and in terms of personalization, which algorithms do for you, you might start running into things like filter bubbles, echo chambers. You will, the idea being you will not encounter new information about the world, you know, factual or opinion or otherwise, because sort of it's personalized for you. So you have particular preferences, particular, you know, ideological beliefs, whatever, and it's just fed right back at you, and you're never exposed to anything new. So that's the idea of a echo chamber. You get, not entirely in that realm, but along the same lines, there now have been a couple articles talking about, how did they phrase it? Sort of, they didn't call it abusive algorithms, but something to that effect, where there is sort of unfortunate side effects of algorithms, like Google's year summary, where they take sort of photos from your Google Plus albums and put it together in a little slideshow. And maybe they give it some happy music and some sparkles and things. So presumably some of you may have gotten that. Sorry?
I thought that was Facebook.
Google does it as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Facebook got on top of it.
Okay. Google sort of got in touch for it as well. Because so this particular reporter, and they picked some metrics for doing this, right? Maybe it's they make sure they have a good spread over time. Maybe it's things that were liked a lot. Of course, there are a lot of reasons to like something. maybe you think it's important, you know, etc. So whatever metrics they choose, they put it all together, and you have things like, this was your year, and then in this particular person's case, that was the year that his daughter had this fatal illness and then died. So it's like, this was your year, and it shows lots of pictures of, you know, his daughter. Like, well, that's great. I guess that was my year, but I didn't really picture yours. So, same general kind of idea, maybe specifically privacy, but having to do with sort of side effects of algorithms at scale and consequences. So that third word is bias. We're not talking about bias quite yet. We're talking about active discrimination. So, shifting along the arms. So, historically, there are various sort of particularly prominent examples of particular kinds of discrimination, which they are sort of different places, different times, maybe legally prohibited. For example, U.S. banks used to have the practice called redlining, where essentially they crunched some numbers or made anecdotal decisions, whatever, and decided that sort of particular neighborhoods which tended to have certain demographics of people were, say, riskier places to make a loan to. So they would literally just draw a red line. And if you were inside of the area that was not sort of what they didn't feel was a good investment, then you just didn't get a loan. So, this is an example, and there are many other examples now. Every time you do various things with hiring, there's this whole blurb about sort of, and states have it differently than federal, but you've got, you know, gender, and disability, and veteran status, and sexual orientation, and all these kinds of things that are legally things you're not allowed to discriminate against. But then, of course, big data, data mining, machine learning makes this a whole fun new realm, because intentionally or not, you may just have a set of features that are a proxy for the thing you're not legally allowed to measure, right? So, interesting problem in terms of enforcement and auditing. I mean, some algorithms let you be a little bit more transparent in terms of what's going on, but a lot of them are a big black box, and nobody can even tell you why things are happening. So if you are trying to audit a corporation and you're trying to look at evidence that they are not discriminating based on X and Y and Z, both in terms of system design and in terms of algorithm design, how exactly do we support this? This is an open research question, by the way. Bias is the third word that's hiding behind me. So, particularly, you can get a lot of unintentional bias in sort of big data, data mining, machine learning in general. So from a technical point of view, as someone who's going to be implementing and running such systems, what are different places in the process where bias might enter in? Yes.
Overfitting.
Okay. Yes. No. Okay. Yes.
Asking leading questions.
Okay.
Questions through our own lens.
So definitely, if there are actual questions being asked, and sort of an analog to that might be, what data are you choosing to collect? Right. Okay. Or what data is easy to collect? You know, what do you have around in terms of metrics? Yes.
Like looking at the demographic that you're actually measuring. You measure everyone who's using the internet, you're still measuring a certain part of the population.
Yes. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. So, you have all these kinds of, stages in the general pipeline, right? What sort of algorithms are you selecting, and what ordinances does that give you? What sort of particular features are you operating off of? Data collection, right? It's how it's getting collected if it is collected at all, is kind of an issue. So here's one example that actually came up as a concern in the White House White Report they did last year on big data issues. Let's say you have a cell phone app that, so there are already for some time been cell phone apps that let you take a picture and report potholes and things like that to, the city. But let's say you have an app that looks at accelerometer data to see where problematic roads are and sort of sends that information. So, increasingly, it's not a terrible assumption to suppose that everyone could have a smartphone if they wanted, although some people choose not to. But, as an example, not everyone might have a smartphone. And you might, for example, disproportionately not get data on sort of less affluent areas, and then sort of they get lots of podcasts. So what data is actually collected if they're not on the internet, right? If you're doing things based on Twitter and not everyone is on Twitter, these sorts of things, how is the data actually collected? What is maybe not being collected that can affect, how you're using data? If there's some reasons that you sub-select from the data, how do you clean the data? If you start throwing out things that are problematic, but those are sort of socially relevant edge cases, then you run into problems there. And also, there's sort of issues of access to data. And this plays particularly into, for example, research outcomes. You sort of do research on the data that you have access to. And this plays into kind of social metrics that are produced as well. So interesting side effects there. So basically, the summary of this little section, and then I spent a long time on this and got to pick up the pace with the later stuff. That's sad. The idea here is that it may be intentional or unintentional. Big data has lots of positive effects, but there's also potential negative side effects in terms of privacy, in terms of discrimination, and in terms of bias. Right? And ways you might characterize that are in terms of sort of availability, both about, do you have the data available about that population, about that characteristic, and also sort of the discrimination might play into availability that is made, think redlining, services not made available. Content, things like filter bubble or sort of offensive kind of, there's something that you find offensive aimed at you because of decisions that were made about you. And sort of how is data about you used elsewhere. So those are some ways you can think about the issue. Now, we're going to skip through this. Oh yeah. Let's talk about this stuff. And the lecture notes, which I assume he will distribute to you, or at least has used in past classes, focus a lot more on this stuff. And this is really fun, and also an active research area. And also a direction that you could sort of very actionably, if you choose, learn more about. Probably not expecting you to run out and become social scientists and lawyers. You can run out and learn about differential privacy. So hey. Big data. We said we liked it because it's great. Personalized health, personalized education. We can detect epidemics. We can detect contaminants in food. We can streamline public services. We can make things more sustainable. Look for fraud. It's great. I'm very happy. So we want to look at all these things we mentioned before. Hey, we didn't mention sort of agricultural data, I think, last time, but let's release all the data. We don't know what it's going to tell us, but it might tell us something good, so let's release it. Well, there are potential privacy problems. So we could say, let's go unconcerned and just privacy is dead, let's not worry about it. Or you have this, the only people who care about privacy have something to hide. Well, we talked about that a little bit. But putting aside all those kinds of issues, what are some technical ways we can address these sorts of things? Okay, so we have some medical records, and we want to release them for research, but we want to avoid insurance fraud and discrimination and reputation damage. So I have some medical records. How am I going to make them private? Okay. Well, whoops. I thought that was the first one slide. How am I going to make them private? Yes.
Normalize, de-identify.
Yeah, let's de-identify it. The idea being, data have personally identifying information associated with them for some definition of personally identifying. let's disassociate those from everything else. So here's a really simple pretend medical record database. It's about discharges, so we have last names, first names, medical record numbers because you're not supposed to use the social security number even though some people kind of mix it in there. We have an address because apparently this is also a billing database. Didn't really need to have them together, but hey. We have discharge date, discharge medication list, admission date, blah, blah, blah. So, how are we going to de-identify this? Suggestions? Yes?
Remove the names and then the addresses.
Okay. All right. So, we could just remove the last name, but of course then, yeah, you might be able to A, go bug them at their door, and that's creepy, or B, just look up where they are. So maybe you get rid of the street, and maybe that's good enough, but maybe everyone is named Alice and Bob except for the one person who either had really creative parents or, you know, is not Anglo-Saxon or whatever, and then sort of that's pretty obvious. So, okay, we have some problems. Maybe we're going to go ahead and remove more than that. So, this is an example, very classic. You may hear people talking about it. LaTanya Sweeney did an interesting study that had to do with de-identified medical records released for research. And, of course, because I'm telling you about this, there's going to be a bad premise punchline. So, what was actually done in this case is these records were discharge records. They were released, and the name, the medical record was removed, and the address was converted to zip only. And you can think there's some good reasons about that. Maybe you want to understand where the demographics of the hospital are coming from in terms of flow. Maybe there's some contaminants, and you're curious about sort of those sorts of things. So, first of all, she looked at the 1990 census summary. We talked about census earlier. And she found that 87% of the population of the United States have, in the census, reported characteristics that likely makes them unique based only on their zip code, the gender, and the date of birth. So is that surprising to you? Obvious? Okay. Maybe because you deal with numbers, maybe because you're cranky, maybe because it's circulated through, you know, general awareness. I don't know. Furthermore, about half of the US population are likely to be identified by only the place, the gender, and the date of birth, where place is basically sort of city, town kind of level. Okay? And even at the county level, again, keeping the date of birth, you have sort of 18% of the US population most likely can be identified. So, as a person, if you want to avoid this, generally speaking, you should be college-aged in a university town, and then, of course, you are less likely to be identified by these things, right? And this is the thing we're going to run into even more. We've got issues of sort of outliers, right? Outliers are distinctive. You could also say, this is a theme that's going to come up again, say, do you really need the date of birth? Like, what is your actual application? Well, for medical applications, I'm guessing the year, or roughly speaking, the year is pretty important because you care about age and health. Maybe there's some kind of correlation between sort of when you were born and some kind of health characteristic. There could be, but you know, do you really need the date? I don't know, maybe. So this is an issue that's going to come more and more. Like, what do you actually need? Which is a bit antithetical to this whole big data, throw it out there and find amazing needles on the haystack. All right, the other theme is combining data sources, which is where most of these problems arise. So she took the voter list from, I think the city's on the next page, in Massachusetts, Cambridge, which was available for $20. She bought the voter list. And a lot of voter lists, by the way, are available, which means that frequently sort of you can look up your birth date and your name and your address So this surprises some people, it's true. Which makes it even interesting because some license plates or driver's licenses for states are deterministically sort of assigned based on your name and your age. So, magical things that are not secrets. So if you go ahead and cross things that are de-identified with other sources of information, and they have overlapping things by which you can join them, then of course you get de-identification. So, yes. Theme, outside data. It's part of the way you have to sort of conceptualize the whole problem. What is within your worldview of what data is, sort of exists? And if outside data comes in, what happens? So this is some of the actual fields that were in the actual discharge record she looked at. $20, Cambridge, got the city right. So she was able to, re-identify some percentage of the people in the set, and as kind of a demonstration and PR stunt, it turned out she was able to re-identify the governor, and so she had the governor's discharge record and sort of mailed it to his office, right? So, we talked about how to protect against this a little bit. Don't be an outlier. Well, that maybe is okay advice if it's something you can control, maybe it's not. Release less information. So, here's another fun example, which some of you may remember. Again, for research. I mean, I love research, but hey. AOL Research released 20 million search keywords from, a large number of their users over a 3-month period. And they were proactive and did some de-identification. They took out the user ID, they took out the IP addresses, because you could use it to sort of, theorize about who it was. And they replaced that with a sort of pseudonym linking identity number. So how many of you remember this in the news? Okay, a couple of you. So you know where this is going. Basically, a number of people were sort of, you could re-identify them based on the content of their search queries. If you start looking for, things that probably describe you, there's probably something about location, maybe you're looking at restaurants, etc. So you start to build profiles of the people. This particular person was re-identified, and sort of the reporters asked if it was okay to talk about her, and she was sort of a piece that they did. So, how could that have been avoided? Suggestions? Yes?
One thing that I think the lecture notes talked about was introducing some error into the data set. Like mix up a few things.
Sure.
So you can't reliably right names of the person.
Add noise, so there's plausible deniability. You could also just, and this hurts for research, but you could also just not have the queries be linked. So you know what is searched, but not sort of with a linking pseudonym. Okay. Another example. The Netflix prize. How many of you heard of the Netflix prize? Improving the Netflix algorithm. You improve the recommendation system by some percentage, 10%, you get a lot of money. Okay, so it was de-identified. But if you, of course, bring in outside data, you can reconstruct sort of some of the people. In this particular case, the demonstration was a research paper, and kind of the point was about the sparse nature characteristics of the data set, and that was part of their point. But what they did is they crossed the Netflix research rating database with the IMDb public ratings, and the specifics don't matter if you actually care about the specifics. You should read the paper, like how to do ground truth and those sorts of things. But basically, again, sparsity played very much into this in terms of unusual movies, right, being good indicators of how to re-identify people. And sparsity. So, how can we protect against this? Here's another example, and this one is recent. So, how many of you remember this from the news? The New York taxi data set. Okay. So the idea here, and I'm not sure about sort of the underlying legal grounds, but I think this was not sort of for research. I think someone actually was able to use a sort of freedom of information request to get taxi records for New York City. And what they did is they took the identifier for the record information, which had trip start time, trip end time, trip starting location, trip end location, the identifying taxi number, so medallion number, half license number, and whether cash or credit was used, and the amount, so the amount in the tip if they had that information. So if they expected sort of the identifier to be an effective pseudonym, that was a really weird thing to do instead of a random number, because depending on how much you know about hash functions, when I say hash functions from a security context, how many of you are like, yeah? Okay, a little bit. One way, yes. Deterministic, yes. Hack license number, medallion numbers follow a particular pattern. So all you have to do is go forward and compare. Right, so of course it takes no time at all to know exactly which taxis you're talking about. So aside from sort of collision issues, but whatever. What are some potential side effects? Well, I would have you think and scratch your chins more, but I want to get through more stuff. First of all, you know, assuming that there isn't sort of underreported money happening, exactly the salary of all the cab drivers, because you can perform addition. Okay. Another proof of concept thing that people had fun doing was, hey, you can track celebrities and you can see whether or not they're good tippers. Because apparently you can just sort of search for celebrities getting in cabs and you get hits, and then you can see sort of the metadata of the photo or when it was posted or whatever, and you can correlate these things. And there were some funny kind of like public relations agents and stuff being like, they pay with card and they tip with cash, so they're actually tipping, you know, for all the celebrities you saw who didn't tip at all. All right, this is one thing. Here's another thing that, and this one actually is browsable, but if you, for example, look at late evening, early morning pickups and drop-offs that correspond to a certain geographical area that has like a lot of strip clubs and things, then you can be like, hey, it's a strip club, you know, map. And you're like, this person or someone who lives in this apartment building just like keeps going back and forth. Right? So this is probably not intended. So aside from the use random numbers, don't, you know, use something that you could reconstruct. Suggestions for protection. I mean, there's all sorts of fun things you can do with locations, but quick suggestions. Yes?
Well, this is things like GPS used to be a little fuzzier. It used to be down to half a mile instead of 3 feet, and fuzzy at the data somehow.
Okay. So in terms of location or in terms of time, you can either
minutes or half hour or whatever.
you can add noise, or you can just make bins by sort of truncating information, right? So it's like somewhere in this block. Now, in terms of sparsity, maybe you want to be intelligent about how you make those bins, and you don't just make it by 30 minutes. Maybe during rush hour, you make it sort of a finite granularity, and you know, around 2 a.m. you make it much rougher granularity, so that people in bins have company, which is something we're about to talk about. So this is a whole fun debate that the de-identification works, no it doesn't, what's acceptable risk, etc. So the problem with this, among other things, is what conversation are you having? Are you having the same conversation? Do you mean most people are safe? Or do you mean everyone is safe? Because outliers are problematic. One argument might be, well, the New York taxi data set, in fact this was an actual argument, did not follow best practices in data identification, so that doesn't count in this debate. To which you might say, you're always going to have people failing to follow best practices. External information. So part of the back and forth about the Netflix paper was, well, that doesn't count because you're bringing in sort of water cooler information. Well, now that we have all these data sources, some of which people supply themselves, primary, and some of which sort of is inferred or sense about them, secondary, you start to have external information. And what about future proofing, right? What about future techniques? So you get the same kind of issue with computer security, for example. Is it information theoretic, or is it sort of computationally secure? If it's computationally secure, 25 years, you have quantum computers and you're going to break it. Okay. Information theoretic, it doesn't matter how much you throw at it, it's not going to break because math. So, there are different approaches you can take to privacy as well, which embody this kind of philosophy. Some example approaches. Now, we'll try not to do much running you over. K-anonymity is in the notes, and at least one person looked at the notes already. K-anonymity has to do with this binning thing that we brought up a couple times. The idea being that, and this was what Tanya Sweeney originally, I think, as well. The information for each person cannot be distinguished from at least K-1 other individuals. So you always are in a group of K, you have K-1 buddies. So there are different ways you can achieve this. You can do suppression, aka redaction. So I was talking about the medical record example. If you're Alice and you're Bob, and there's another Alice and another Bob and stuff, we don't care about that. But if you have your name is Springtime, and someone else's name is something you don't see a lot, you can just, they have no first names anymore. They're just, no. Okay, so we can suppress. We can also generalize. Think ages, right? Or if you have, a sample where you have only, one person of a couple different ethnicities, and there are now three people in ethnicity A or B, right? Generalize. So this is about smart binning, more or less. Of course, all kinds of other issues. What K is the right K? This says nothing about being able to determine whether or not you're in said group. But you can still make inferences about you and your K-1 buddies. Maybe that doesn't help you, right? Differential privacy. Also in the notes. Roughly speaking, the main idea is that you are trying to account for the differential between if you, for example, you are taking a survey, and the differential privacy is to cover the difference between whether you participated or whether you did not. More or less. By which I mean, there is a sensitivity cost that is associated with acquiring certain kinds of information. So if you make a lot of requests, that budget adds up. If you make very specific requests, that budget adds up. It's about, roughly speaking, a tally of the information. So why? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Because part of the point is that you add noise, frequently and kind of traditionally Laplacian noise, to hide that differential between whether you provided said information or not. So, of course, depending on your model, it's sort of an active database that you can have active queries to, and then you sort of store the first response and always get the same response, or do you have to have a budget and you cut off queries? There are all these kinds of questions for how you deal with the system. But you can imagine, if you just add Laplacian noise and you keep giving this query, and you add new noise every time, all you have to do eventually is average, right? And, the information is leaked. That's intuitively why the sensitivity budget is different. So, you would, for example, there's this survey that says, what's your gender, what's your age, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream, and you would sort of give a sensitivity of 1 to sort of the question, how many males participated. Because there's sort of, if you were to participate versus not participate, you could at most be one man or not a man. So you're going to change it by multiple, right? So when you start getting into questions of, say, you could ask, how many scoops of ice cream did you eat today? And apparently this is a closed world, we can only eat 0 to 3. So that kind of question, sort of how many ice cream scoops were eaten, would be sort of a sensitivity of 3, because you could have at most eaten 3. Right? So, what are some ways you can misuse differential privacy? Well, there is intentionally noise in there. And if you start doing math with returns in the bottom of your division, you're going to magnify your error. So generally speaking, that's problematic. Buckets. You have to make your buckets intelligently. Otherwise, for example, if you start having sparse buckets, if we're talking ages, and there's a lot of people who are, certain age, and presumably eventually you start to, not have as many people in certain years. If you don't group them together, then suddenly the noise is kind of obscuring all interesting information there. So you can't sort of rely on those buckets to find interesting things. This is not entirely accurate, but if we're going to provide a caricature of differential privacy, the positive would be that it is sort of a provable, formal, statistical way to approach privacy. So it doesn't matter what new, techniques or what new information comes along later, sort of these properties hold. If you were to provide a caricature of the negative, it always gives the worst case. So people might argue it's not very practical for application X or Y or Z. For example, there was a research paper looking at making sort of an ad broker system for targeted advertising, one aspect of which, aside from sort of dividing the trust among different third parties, one aspect of which was addressing queries that advertisers and companies might have in terms of characteristics of these parties and employing differential privacy. So sort of they very quickly assume the worst case, very quickly you can't return any information. So there are different ways to address this, also open research problem. And I'll wrap up pretty quick here. There are also all kinds of domain-specific approaches to privacy. So here's one example. That was a paper that was about de-identifying mirror images to make sure they're still useful for research, but not identifying. Generally speaking, the noun, the morphology, of the skull is going to tell you a lot about what the face looks like, help you re-identify the person. So there are various kind of approaches. You can do fuzzing, blah, 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 or in this case, you can just chop the face off and miss most of the brain that you care about. So, domain-specific approaches. And this plays into the kinds of themes we are coming up with the taxi cab, etc. sort of situations. What exactly do you need the information for in terms of the kind of application that you envision? Because if you know exactly what you're using it for, you can know what you can throw away, right? If you just kind of hoping things will happen, then you're going to have a problem because you want to release more information rather than less, and you really aren't quite sure what measures are appropriate to use or not. But here, domain-specific, we know what we want, what we don't want, blah, 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 algorithms, chop off the face. Okay. Also domain-specific, we're now getting into interesting kind of things where privacy, yes, has to do with you, but also has to do with others. You volunteered to be in a study that has to do a cohort on disease study, rare diseases, whatever. There are other kinds of domain-specific factors at play. For example, relatives have related DNA, yes. Also, the phenotype of a person, you can sort of know from certain measurements, photos, etc. And there are some sort of genotypes you can determine from the phenotype in question. And then suddenly, you, by participating in the study, might be violating the privacy of others unintentionally, right? And this is sort of maybe the approach you want to take. Maybe it's domain-specific, right? And I am going to let you go because you've been very patient. But questions are also welcome. In terms of the takeaways for sort of the last section of the talk, so near the beginning we had privacy contested, We had, privacy is reactionary. We had sort of different characterizations of harm, different characterizations of data sources, different characterizations of sort of where bias can come into the process. And here, some of the issues we have are, provable versus not. Is there outside data versus not? What exactly are you using the data in question for later? Determining what kind of measures you're using. So yeah. Hope this was somewhat informative of things to keep in mind, both sort of at a high level in terms of being an educated scholar, and also literal things you might be doing on sort of the technological ground floor that can still have a huge impact later. Right? Thank you. Yes, sorry, so you are
Undergrad.
okay. Yeah, I'm on the schedule to spring next year. And the slides